You know, there's some questions that have been around forever, right? Questions that have kept philosophers up at night, that have seriously challenged people of faith, and honestly have touched every single one of us at some point. And today, we're diving headfirst into one of the biggest, the paradox of suffering.
So it all really comes down to this one huge question. I mean, think about it. If you believe in a God who is, on one hand, all-powerful, omnipotent, right? And on the other hand, perfectly good, well then all the evil and pain in the world just feels like a giant, glaring contradiction. How on earth can both of those things be true at the same time?
And this slide, wow, it just lays out the core conflict perfectly, doesn't it? On one side, you've got this idea of a perfect, loving, all-powerful creator. But then on the other side, you have the world we actually live in, with disease, natural disasters, war, all kinds of cruelty. These two things just don't seem to fit together. They're constantly at odds. And that tension, that's exactly where we're starting our journey today.
Okay, so there's actually a formal name for trying to solve this puzzle. It's called a theodicy. Kind of sounds complicated, but it literally just comes from the Greek for justification of God. It's basically the whole field of study dedicated to figuring out a logical way for a good God and a suffering world to possibly coexist.
So first up, let's jump into some of the big philosophical arguments, the attempts to tackle this whole problem using pure reason and logic.
All right, philosophers have come at this from a few different angles. You've got one idea, from Leibniz, that says, hey, this is the best of all possible worlds. Any world that's created is going to have some flaws by definition. Then there's what's called the pedagogical view, the idea that suffering is basically a tool for our growth, like a really tough teacher that's supposed to build our character. But probably the most famous argument of them all is the free will defense.
The thinking behind this one goes something like this. For love and goodness to actually mean anything, we have to choose them freely, right? I mean, if God just made us like robots who are programmed to only do good things, our choices wouldn't have any real moral weight. So for free will to be genuine, the option to choose evil has to exist. And all the suffering we see? Well, that's the awful tragic downside of that freedom.
But there's a really strong counterargument to that. Critics will jump in and say, hang on a second, our free will's already limited. I mean, you and I can't choose to fly, right? We can't just decide to create a universe. If those limits don't cancel out our free will, then why would being made incapable of, say, committing horrible atrocities suddenly negate it? It's a really sharp point, and it shows that this debate is, well, it's nowhere near settled.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. We're going to move away from pure abstract logic and dive into a really powerful, ancient story that just blows all the easy answers out of the water. The story of Job.
And man, this story is just devastating. Job is a genuinely good guy who loses everything, his family, his wealth, his health. It's unimaginable. And then his friends show up, and you'd think they'd be there to comfort him, but no, they just keep insisting you must have done something wrong to deserve this. But Job, he holds his ground. He knows he's innocent, and he actually demands an answer from God himself. And when God finally does speak, he doesn't give a reason. Instead, he just shows Job the sheer mind-bending complexity of the universe, basically showing him how massive the gap is between what a human can understand and, well, everything else.
So really, the book of Job is this huge warning against trying to fit suffering into a neat little box. Job's friends, they represent that easy, tidy belief that, if you suffer, you must have done something to deserve it. The story just completely rejects that idea. It forces us to accept that innocent people suffer, and that's a real and deeply profound part of life. In the end, the story of Job doesn't give us an answer. It gives us a different way to stand in the face of it all, a posture of humility when we're up against this massive mystery. It kind of suggests that maybe our desperate need for a logical A plus B equals C reason for every single bad thing that happens, maybe that's just the wrong question to be asking in the first place.
All right, next, let's look at a really big theological idea that tries to place suffering inside a much, much larger story, a whole cosmic narrative. So according to this worldview, the world wasn't supposed to be like this. It started out perfect, described as very good. But then something called the fall happens. Sin enters the picture, and it corrupts everything, bringing a curse on the world, things like decay, struggle, and pain. But even inside this now broken reality, the story doesn't just end there. It offers hope through redemption and points ahead to a future promise, a new creation, where all of this is finally made right and suffering is gone for good. So from this point of view, suffering is basically an intruder. It doesn't belong here. It's a tragic and, importantly, temporary part of a world that's, well, not the way it's supposed to be.
It was never part of God's original design, and it's definitely not part of his final plan. It's like a painful chapter in a much, much bigger book.
But what happens when suffering reaches a scale so extreme, so horrific, that it seems to shatter every framework we have? The Holocaust did just that. It forced an absolutely radical rethinking of all these ideas for a whole new generation.
As the theologian Didier Polyphate explains, the sheer scale of it, the systematic evil of the Holocaust, it posed an almost unbearable challenge to that traditional picture of a God who is all-powerful and who steps in to stop evil. The question became unavoidable. If God could intervene, why didn't he?
And this led to some really profound shifts in how people thought about God. Some thinkers started to reconsider what God's power even means. Maybe it isn't about direct hands-on intervention, but something else entirely. Others started talking more about a God who isn't absent, but is actually present with people in their suffering, sharing their pain. And maybe most importantly, it put this huge new focus on our responsibility as human beings.
And this quote from Polyphate just hits so hard. It captures that shift perfectly. The idea is that even in the absolute, unimaginable darkness of Auschwitz, some people still made ethical choices. They showed kindness, they resisted, they held on to their dignity. And that proved that morality wasn't totally wiped out. So if ethics were possible even there, well then the responsibility for fighting evil falls squarely on our shoulders now.
So, after exploring all of these different paths, where does that leave us? It's pretty clear we're not landing on one single simple answer. Instead, what we have is a kind of synthesis, a collection of all these different ways of grappling with this enormous question.
I mean, think about it. We've looked at philosophy trying to solve it like a logic puzzle, with things like the free will defense. We've seen the ancient story of Job, which frames it as this profound mystery we just can't fully grasp. We've explored theology, which puts it inside this epic story of a fallen world and future redemption. And we've seen how a modern event like the Holocaust turned the whole question into a radical call for us, for humans, to act.
What really stands out after all this is that there's no silver bullet, right? There's no one sentence that's going to suddenly make all the pain in the world make sense. What we're left with instead is this really rich, complicated, and often contradictory tapestry of ideas. You've got logic, faith, mystery, and hope, all woven together.
And maybe that leads us to the biggest, most important shift in perspective of all. Maybe the ultimate goal isn't to find a perfect answer to why suffering exists. Maybe the real question, the one that truly defines who we are, is how we respond to it when we see it. In our world, in the people around us, and even in ourselves.